It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the Academy this evening, to this open lecture, which is organized in cooperation between the University of Oslo and the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. Tonight we will hear a lecture by Stephen Greene, who chairs the Natural History Museum in London and the Asia House. He served as a group chairman of the HSBC Bank from 2005 to 2011, and was then the Minister of State and Trade and Investment in the British government, 2011 to 2013. I expect it was challenging, but maybe not quite as challenging as it is for the Minister of Trade now. He is also an ordained priest in the Church of England and a member of the House of Lords. Lord Greene is a celebrated contributor to contemporary debates and international conversations on cultural, geopolitical, religious, and environmental issues that face the increasingly connected and urbanized people of Europe and Asia. In his most recent book, The Human Odyssey, East, West, and the Search for Universal Values, Greene discusses China along with other Asian cultures such as Japan and their relationship to Europe. He explores subjects such as politics, literature, religion, theology, science, culture, constellations of power throughout history, and current offsets, and asks, what will be the future of Eurasia? There will be a possibility to buy a signed copy of the book after the lecture event tonight. And the topic of the book is also the topic of today's lecture. Viewed geopolitically, the main question is whether and how the worldviews of the two most important and influential powers on the New World stage, China and America, the one fundamentally Confucian, the other essentially individualist, can be constructively synthesized. At a deeper level, though, the great question is whether and how the irreversible fact of urbanization will nurture the growth of human individuality in every society, such as the wisdom of others transforms and enriches all those great Eurasian cultures. We look very much forward to hearing more about this from Lord Stephen Greene. Please, the floor is yours.
Good. Well, first of all, thank you very much for a rather too generous introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here. This is not my first visit to Oslo, but it is my first for several years, and the first where I've had a few days to not only deliver this lecture and one or two other things that I've been invited to do, but also to look around a city which I have enjoyed very much. We were at the Munch Museum this morning, we were at the Modern Art Museum yesterday, we have plans for tomorrow, and by the time we leave on Wednesday, I intend to have ensured that I and my wife are suitably enriched by the culture that's so readily available in a lovely city. It's raining. We were saying just now that the weather reminds me of London in January. I was expecting it to be snowing here. The fact that it's raining tells you something about climate change, maybe. You're heading into the sort of winter that we take for normal in London. There it is. So China's century with a question mark and the implications for us all is my topic. And I begin with the thought that we, the Europeans, and the Chinese both have our home in what is in fact the world's largest landmass, namely Eurasia, of course. Eurasia including everything from Ireland at one end to Vladivostok at the other. It's a landmass which has 2/3 of the world's population and produces about 2/3 of the world's economic output. It is also a landmass which is home to all of the world's great living cultures. They all originate in Eurasia. We are living through a time in which we're seeing a historic rebalancing of Asia, of Eurasia. We're seeing the shift of a center of gravity. We're living through what I regard as Asia's century, which is, of course, a century in which China in particular will play a central and decisive role in the coming decades. As connections have been established and broadened and economic development has gathered pace, so our knowledge of the context in which we all live and of each other has deepened, and life experience everywhere has become enormously more complex more sophisticated, more interconnected. And yet what has emerged is not any kind of shared polity or common identity, at least not yet. Growing connectivity and interaction have not produced any sense of deep shared interest or common purpose. Rather, all of the jostling has produced a balance amongst a handful of dominant powers, each with its own identity rooted in its own history and self-understanding. By the dawn of the new millennium, it was becoming clear which these dominant powers are. China and India, of course, the two behemoths of Eurasia. Russia, straddling both Asia and Europe, and ill at ease with all of its neighbors. Japan, with its uniquely strong social psychology, more impenetrably different, I would suggest, than any other major society on Earth. And America, whose Pacific interests draw them into inevitable Eurasian geopolitical involvement, even though Eurasia is not, of course, their homeland. And then what about Europe? Prosperous, but struggling to achieve cohesion and unsure, perhaps, of what it stands for in the 21st century. And what about the Muslim Ummah? Also fractured at its throats in so many ways and tragically, and at the same time finding it difficult to come to terms with modernity. But in all of this, the most influential and significant change that has taken place and which is underway is surely the rise of China. At the dawn of the new millennium, this Eurasian balance of power looks increasingly like what became known in the context of European history as the Westphalian Order. Cultures differ, national governments are sovereign, they respect the balance of power. Europe arrived at this point in 1648 by exhaustion at the end of the 30 Years' War, after a destructive experience that was the worst Europe had known until the First World War. Eurasia in the 21st century seems to be arriving at it through mutual recognition of realities based on the extraordinary transformation of the balance of economic power that has been taking place for about 30 years now. For we now recognize, do we not, that a historic convergence is underway. In 1820, the size of an economy relative to the world's total output was roughly equal to that country's share of world population. Then, as now, China had the largest population and its economy was the largest in the world. We all know what happened thereafter. China was left behind, first by the Europeans, then the Americans, then the Japanese, as the Industrial Revolution gathered pace. Well, the gap is now closing again, as China, and indeed country after country in East Asia in particular, start to catch up with the standards of living which the Europeans have come to take for granted. Within a few years, on present trends, China will probably be the world's largest economy again. This much we're familiar with, but this is just a milestone. The best central forecast for China is that it will continue to grow relatively fast compared with the older economies of Europe, at least, for another generation. And so as its income per head gradually approaches European levels, China will not just be the largest, but by far the largest economy in the world, perhaps well over double the next largest. China is already the largest investor in Africa. It's a larger foreign direct investor than any European country already. Its rail network, its high-speed rail network, is the largest. It's the largest producer and consumer of steel. It's the largest emitter of carbon dioxide. It has the largest military, measured by headcount, in the world. Also, it's at least equal in digital technology, as the whole saga of 5G and Huawei is reminding us every day at the moment. More and more, the Europeans begin to fear that Chinese technical brilliance may overwhelm them even in the very areas of strength that we have prided ourselves in. In other words, it's not just a matter of particular sectors of technical strength, aerospace, digital competence. It's something more fundamental than that we worry about. Whether it's primary research as opposed to what we have occasionally derided as mere application, or artistic creativity as opposed to what we have occasionally derided as mere excellence in performance, or elegance and originality of design as opposed to what we have derided as imitation and kitsch, or education which stresses lateral thinking as opposed to mere rote learning, we've wanted, one way or another, to hang on to something distinctive which wouldn't be swamped by the rising tide. But the truth is that with every passing decade, it becomes ever clearer that there are no European heights that the Chinese, and indeed other Asians, will not eventually scale. The Americans face the same challenge, of course, but the Europeans ruefully recognize, when we're being honest with ourselves, how the much greater inventiveness, drive, and flexibility of the American society and economy has enabled them to continue to renew themselves in the most unpredictable ways. No European country, after all, has been able to match the spectacular successes of Silicon Valley, which few had even heard of when China was beginning to open up some 30 years ago. As an economist friend of mine said once, never short America for very long. Europe, on the other hand, has retreated from being the self-defined center of the world to what it was before the 15th century, to being a corner of the Eurasian landmass. It's a large and prosperous market, of course. It's an agreeable place to live, of course, for the most part. But yes, it's also lacking in cohesion, self-confidence, and it's unsure of what it really stands for in an era where it's lost strategic significance to the Americans because of the end of the Cold War. Meanwhile, the Chinese are in expansionary mode. The obvious sign of this is what's known as the Belt and Road Initiative, an enormously diffuse concept of investing in infrastructure development to open up connectivity, initially between East and West, the old Silk Road. It was originally called the New Silk Road. But now something much more than that, involving investment and commitment in such places as Africa and Latin America, and indeed Eastern Europe. But will the Chinese path to a position of dominating significance in Eurasia really be as smooth as all that? Is there, if you will, a bear case for China as well as the obvious bull case? For there are in fact some dangerous landmines on the road ahead for Asia as a whole and for China in particular. The geopolitical risks are surely greater now than they have been for a generation. Today's Eurasian geopolitics are in some ways like those of 19th century Europe. And indeed, all of the elements which made for the European tragedy that followed in the 20th century are clearly visible on what is now a Eurasian and not just a European stage. To begin with, we need to remember that there are 5 established nuclear powers engaged on the continent, and at least 6 other countries with varying degrees of commitment to and capability of nuclearization. There is at least one rogue state ready to play, perhaps, the role that Serbia played in 1914 in Europe. Maybe there's more than one. Certainly the obvious ones all have nuclear pretensions. And cultural identities, which proved so dangerous in Europe, are alive and flourishing in all the major Asian powers. In China itself, in India, in Russia, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and we should never forget Japan. We can see where the potential flashpoints are, of course. The South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, the Korean Peninsula, South Asia, and the cauldron of the Middle East, of course. And the Chinese have an interest in all of these areas. So, what is going on? Just over 30 years ago, towards the end of 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. I, and no doubt many of us here, will vividly remember seeing the radical changes that took place in Russia and like dominoes through East and Central Europe. There was tragedy as well as new dawns, of course. We were living in Hong Kong at the time and well remember what was going on in Beijing in 1989. Overall, however, despite the tragedy, the fact is that the new dawn was extraordinary. New hope for hundreds of millions of people, especially in Asia and actually mostly in China. Indeed, a couple of months ago I was in Qingdao in Shandong province in China. Shandong province is the birthplace of Confucius and therefore a deeply significant part of China to anybody with a knowledge and understanding of Chinese culture and history. Qingdao itself, the former German concession, a very pretty town centre sitting on a lovely bay with a modern metropolis built all round it, and you go into the shopping malls that look as though they were built yesterday, and they are full of people enjoying modern comforts and all of the variety that a modern prosperous economy can offer. The transformation is genuinely extraordinary. But new dawns rarely turn out to be as bright as they seem, and this one certainly didn't. Economically, to begin with, it ushered in huge change and brought plenty of fruits, yes. For all of the difficulties we now see in retrospect in the global economy, we should never forget that a human achievement. We have seen the biggest material change for the largest number of people in one generation that the world has ever seen. Nevertheless, that very achievement led to excesses and to an overweening confidence. Ideologically, free market liberalism seemed to have won the day, and soon it was felt that it would sweep the world. Its system of values seemed to be rooted in the principle that everything, including human happiness, has its price. And it followed from this that the business of business was to make profits, and if everyone worked to maximize profits, human welfare as a whole would be maximized. It was all nice and simple, too much so. For we learnt some painful truths later on, did we not? That markets are not stable or self-stabilizing. They are, as it were, not like gyroscopes which always right themselves. And that societies are not just collections of individuals. In fact, the philosophical pushback has gained momentum in the last 10 to 15 years or so. The Chinese government has never accepted that a flourishing private sector requires an elective democracy, for example. Indian intellectuals can be heard bemoaning the materialism of the me society, which has flooded into India in recent years. Muslims who feel that the individualism of the modern era sits uncomfortably with their family values. And let's face it, whilst they may be more vocal about this, there would be plenty of people with a Christian background or a Christian heritage who would feel the same. And now we're beginning to see something else. We're beginning to see how artificial intelligence will radically reshape economies over the next generation, so that businesses will no longer need to manufacture in low-cost labour markets to the extent that they have done, and which was so often the first step on the ladder of modernization. It was the first step out of poverty for what are today's middle-income countries like China. It will no longer be available, possibly, to the next generation of poor countries with low skill bases, in Africa, for example. It will also threaten more and more administrative and middle management office jobs, even in the high-income countries, so that traditional middle-class roles in developed countries as well as in middle-income countries will be radically affected. Socially, this has also been the dawn of the digital revolution, and especially of the rise of social media. This is transforming the way whole societies work. Our lives are being changed radically in all of their aspects, and we're still living through the midst of this. But it's affecting our work lives, our family lives, our social lives in ways that we perhaps still don't fully recognize. The social media have in particular given what I might describe as the demos a new voice. The demos meaning the unorchestrated opinions of ordinary people, where every word in that sentence is important. It's fashionable for established political voices to deride this as populism very often. But the truth is that no one in either business or politics, or indeed in any public leadership position, can any longer simply ignore the moods and demands of the demos. For the social media have turned what we used to call the butterfly effect into a major social phenomenon, as images go viral in a way which is often unpredictable and uncontrollable. So the digital world, we shouldn't be surprised by this, has got its bright side and its dark side. We know this because all human creativity does. What is less often noted is that the digital revolution is a potential source of further inequality. The immense connectivity it provides can be used as a powerful education to enlightenment and a powerful incentive, powerful aid to enlightenment and education, or it can be used to squander a life in mindless gaming activity and various other even less attractive uses of time. For the individual, it can offer powerful leverage or wasteful distraction on a scale never known before. Then thirdly, the increased connectivity which defines our age has created historically unprecedented levels of urbanization and cultural fluidity. These days, more than half the population of the world lives in big cities, and most of them have migrated into them in the last 20 to 30 years. In Europe, the percentage is already over 80%, and in some countries over 90%. And in Asia, all the signs are the direction of travel is the same, and that Asia will catch Europe up over the next 30, 40 years or so. The result will be extraordinary. In any role in life today already, whether in senior or not so senior positions, in any sphere, public, social, business, we have contact with and relationships with other people whom we influence for good or for ill. And these days, such relationships are effectively always multicultural. That's the result of the other great change, of this great change which is sweeping through the world and changing the way we think about ourselves and each other forever. Urbanization is the great phenomenon of our time. Cities are hard to control. They're whirlpools of cultural interaction and change. We do not yet fully understand what the effect will be on the human consciousness. In my case, personally, I've had the great privilege of living in different cities of the world. I actually grew up in a small village, but all of my adult life has been spent in large cities in different places. And I now live in what is measurably the most international city in the world. Well over half of all of London's residents, including myself, were born somewhere else, and over a third were born outside the country. I've worked all my life in organizations which have included colleagues from every major cultural background and belief system. This has been an enormously enriching experience for me personally, but it poses some obvious questions which we do well to ponder. To what extent can we assume a common understanding of values and purposes in life, whatever our specific cultural background? And then there's another thing. As Europeans, we tend in modern times to be embarrassed about the idea of the nation state. Well, I can't speak for Norway, but in general, in the wake of the tragedies and traumas of the 20th century, we have reacted against the notion of national patriotism. And we like to believe, some of us, that the nation is becoming increasingly passé as we discover wider loyalties and broader connectivity. Well, maybe, but it would be good to recognize that the Asian view of these things is very different, and that the nation state is alive and well, and pervasively there is a rising cultural assertiveness, as well as in some cases increasing social control exercised through the nation state. To paraphrase Mark Twain, the famous American writer, reports of the death of the culturally assertive nation state are much exaggerated. And whether you look at China or Russia or India or Turkey or Japan or several others that I could name, you can't go there without being struck by the degree of national assertiveness, cultural assertiveness, which is more and more vibrant as the 21st century unfolds. It is perhaps not what we might have expected in 1989, but we'd do well to recognize that it is the case. It would be therefore easy to assume, perhaps, that the challenges of cultural diversity are now so huge that all we can reasonably expect to do globally is operate on the Westphalian principle, to go back to an order of nation relationships that I've just mentioned. And if that were all that could be said about the next 100 years or so, it wouldn't augur very well for us. For the Westphalian parallel is not a reassuring one. We know what the Westphalian order led to in the late 19th and then the first half of the 20th century in Europe. So if the Westphalian order of a balance of power amongst sovereign entities that recognize each other's right to be culturally assertive within their own sphere of control, then what might still be hoped for and worked for would be painstaking consensus on matters of shared interest, for sure, on the environment and climate change, for example, on scarce natural resources, on international terrorism, on nuclear non-proliferation, and so forth. And these are not trivial gains indeed. But it would nevertheless suggest that for at least the foreseeable future, for the next century, let's say, we would have reached some kind of limit to the human spiritual journey. And we would have reached that limit at a potentially dangerous moment in history. For we are, in fact, on the threshold of an era which will see two different perspectives on the human self-understanding contest for legitimacy on the world stage. They are, in effect, the worldviews, the deeply rooted instincts of the two great powers which are going to dominate the Eurasian and world stage for the next several decades, America and China. Let me spend a few minutes on each of those. The American self-understanding and worldview has, of course, much in common with the European understanding and worldview. And indeed, it inherited much of its instinct from the Europeans, right the way from the Pilgrim Fathers in the 17th century, and I suppose the Spanish before that. I'm betraying my North European connectivity in saying that. But it's also clearly a distinctive society with a very different centre of gravity than the modern European perspective and self-understanding. It may have originally come from Europe, but the fact is that the American worldview sets the inalienable subjectivity of the individual self at its core. This notion came originally from Europe. It lies at the root of the borderless idea of liberal democracy. It is what is encapsulated by those great watchwords of the founders of America: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's worth reminding ourselves of all of that, because it's a reminder that despite all of the doubts about and philosophical challenges to the liberal democratic consensus over the last 10 years or so, what we're dealing with is a view of human identity which wasn't just the invention of Adam Smith and his contemporaries. Rather, it's a deeply rooted instinct that comes from the European exploration of the nature of the human self over many centuries. Meanwhile, the great alternative on the world stage of this century, the Confucian culture, which is the bedrock of a Chinese worldview, is not primarily focused on the autonomy of the self. It sees the individual in a wider familial, social, and even cosmic context. So it has much less to say about rights and much more to say about position, purposes, and obligations in life. It would be simplistic to simplify either of those two world understandings too much. These are both complex heritages of two great nations, but they are not the same. Since China's evolving worldview and self-understanding is perhaps less familiar to us than that of America, we need first to look, I think, at the road that China has been on in recent years, and which has brought it to that point. 30 years ago, in the early stages of opening up, Deng Xiaoping famously said that China should hide its capacity internationally, that it should bide its time, and that it should be good at maintaining a low profile and should never claim leadership. This was Deng Xiaoping's China of the 1990s. As time moved on, that position began to shift. China spoke of taking a more active role in international affairs and working to make the international order more just and equitable as it sees it. Specifically, China spoke of recognizing what it has called a community of common destiny, that's a phrase that appears in the rhetoric, in its regional neighborhood. In 2014, Xi Jinping took the next step forward when he spoke not merely of recognizing China's neighborhood as a community of common destiny, but of turning it into one. And then in 2017, he began to speak on the international stage of working together to build, and again this phrase is in the rhetoric, you can look it up in United Nations speeches, a community of shared future for all humankind. He was in Davos a couple of 3 years ago, I think 2017, and used that phrase. He has made a major speech at around in the same year at the United Nations. And in other words, this was China's foreign policy going global. It's certainly not a detailed blueprint for how China plans to act internationally over the coming decades, but it is, to use a business school cliche, a vision statement. Something of a statement of purpose for the way in which China intends to engage over the next generation. In Xi Jinping's speech, he conjured up the promise, and again I quote, of an open, inclusive, clean and beautiful world that enjoys lasting peace, universal security and common prosperity. And we shouldn't overlook how he articulates that general vision. He talked about the need for countries to respect each other, to discuss their issues as equals. He spoke of the need to promote trade and investment and commercial connectivity through business relationships. And here's the important bit. Well, it's all important, but here's a particularly important bit. He spoke of the importance of recognizing and respecting the diversity of civilizations with, quotes, estrangement replaced by exchange, clashes by mutual learning, and superiority by coexistence. It's worth savoring for a moment some of those words. They are, of course, a statement of the Westphalian principle. The reference to diversity of civilizations and to clashes, deliberately, I suspect, calls to mind Samuel Huntington's famous book from the 1990s, The Clash of Civilizations. The crucial point to notice here is that China's newly articulated vision is fundamentally national and societal rather than individual. This is a long way from the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The actors in their version of the drama are countries. The vision is not of an emerging global citizenship of individuals. Their starting point, if you will, is Confucius, not Locke. And certainly more Confucius than Marx, by the way. The contrast with the strong individualist instinct which underlies the American view of the world is surely unmistakable. So this is sometimes seen as the great debate between America and China, or if you will, between East and West, but I think it is more specifically a debate between America and China, about the individual and the collective. But it is actually deeper than that, for it is, at an underlying level, a question about human self-understanding. And the great question that matters to us all is how those two worldviews of the human self, each of which has a very long trail of history behind it, can be dovetailed into some kind of a synthesis over the course of this next century. And the reason why that question matters so much is because it's important for the peace of nations, perhaps obviously. It matters for balanced economic and social development, and it matters for the sustainability of life on an increasingly fragile planet. What brings this seemingly rather metaphysical set of questions about human self-understanding into sharp focus is in fact the profoundly challenging planetary threat, which is now the shared existential danger of the whole of Eurasia, and indeed, of course, of the whole of humanity. No one in any sphere of activity can any longer afford to ignore the significance of this great crisis. And we all know what is at stake. As the human population continues to expand, and as developing countries continue to grow their appetite for the physical benefits and the standard of living which we Europeans and increasingly East Asians take for granted, the impact on the planet becomes more and more severe with every passing year. We now have what the economists call a problem of the commons, and we have it on a planetary scale. And in consequence, I want to argue that there can be no enduring Westphalian stasis. That there is, in fact, a direction of travel for nations, cultures, and individuals, even if the journey ahead is long and risky, and even if many are reluctant, because there is no alternative. At the core of the planetary emergency lies the simple point that what is rational for the individual may not be rational for the community. If an asset is freely available and its supply is not unlimited, it will be overused. The classic example from agricultural societies is common land, which was always at risk of being overgrazed, but the problem lurks in human history in all sorts of ways. Underlying the recurrent westward movements of steppe peoples through much of Eurasian history, there was in effect a problem of the commons. The search for new lands, for a nomadic way of life, the depredation of agricultural communities, and even the sacking of cities for their booty were all ways of seizing assets which were freely available at little or no cost to the successful warrior, as demonstrated above all by the Mongols. Thomas Malthus was the economist, actually a clergyman and economist, who set out this problem in stark demographic terms just before the turn of the 19th century, just before the global human population began its rapid and apparently remorseless rise. Malthus held that populations always tend to expand to use up the available resources, and he argued that no improvement of living standards would therefore ever be possible. Over the 200 years since he wrote, he's been shown to be wrong. He didn't foresee the substantial growth in living standards which has in fact accompanied population growth, which itself has been much larger than he can ever have imagined. For technical progress has given humanity a remarkable ability to maximize yields, to find new reserves of resources that were running low, and to develop alternatives to particular resources that were running out. So the doomsayers about limits to growth have repeatedly found themselves embarrassed by their predictions. And yet, was he so wrong? What if the entire planetary system itself is disturbed, and on such a scale that biodiversity is seriously threatened and the conditions of life are degraded? For that's the version of the problem of the commons which now confronts all of us, from one end of Eurasia to the other, and indeed, of course, more broadly through the world, for the rest of this century. The problem has become everybody's problem because the total impact on the planet of urban demographic explosion has created a catastrophe in the making. What is more, we're still in the early stages of its outworkings. The whole planetary environment is now the commons of the new, connected, urbanized era. Some parts of that environment are pure examples of commons, assets freely available to all, which fall under no sovereignty or any form of ownership. The oceans, the Arctic ice cap, the stratosphere into which we pump our carbon dioxide. These are all available to all humans, all human societies, on an entirely unrestricted basis, unless we choose collectively to restrict access. And where we don't, the full force of the problem is becoming clear to us all. The Arctic ice cap is melting, we all know that, to the point where shippers can now contemplate opening up northern shipping lanes as part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to take goods from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The amount of traffic on that northern route is growing very fast, from a small base admittedly, but growing very fast. It tells you that something is awry. Now, the planetary environment also has assets which are not commons in the strict sense, because they are under sovereign control and in some cases in private ownership as well. And yet they are, so to speak, gifts to the whole of humanity. And the irony about the Westphalian order is that it may make it even harder to achieve progress in the case of goods which are under sovereign control than in the case of goods which are pure commons. There are two, I would suggest, important examples of this. One is the tropical rainforests, because of their importance in the carbon cycle and their significant potential in pharmaceutical research. Of the three main areas of tropical rainforest in the world, one is in Eurasia, the other two are in Africa and Latin America, and in the absence of effective controls on forest clearance in any of the main countries concerned, these are disappearing as fast as the Arctic ice cap is. And the effects on the world's climate and environment are just as serious. A second example, and one that is nearer home to our subject of this evening, is fresh water supplies. Asia's fresh water supplies are under growing stress as a result of all of the economic development which has now been underway for 30 or 40 years. And it is a geographic fact that Asia has less fresh water per inhabitant than any other region of the world. Furthermore, the facts of geography have ensured that the resulting challenges are cross-border threats to the Westphalian order. The high Tibetan plateau, with its bountiful sources of glacial water, is the source of no less than 10 of Asia's major rivers. As many as 18 other countries depend on one or more of these rivers for their fresh water. Dam construction, as well as industrial and agricultural pollution, are serious sources of geopolitical tension, affecting in particular the Brahmaputra River and the Mekong River in South and Southeast Asia, respectively. In Central Asia, the Aral Sea, which straddles the border between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, used to be the fourth largest freshwater lake in the world. Irrigation projects in Soviet times drained its feeder rivers, and it is now less than 10% of its original size and badly salinated. Lake Balkhash in Kazakhstan is now at risk of the same fate. It is being drained by the growing offtake of water from its feeder rivers in China's neighboring Xinjiang province. As urbanization, economic development, and demographic pressure continue, the demand for water will continue to rise, and it is one of those very few natural resources that is not replaceable by anything. It would not be hard to envisage this becoming one of the most dangerous flashpoints of international relationships of the 21st century, particularly in Central, South, and Southeast Asia, and once again, China is involved. At the same time, the biodiversity of freshwater is degrading rapidly. More than half of all freshwater species are now on the endangered list of the International Union for Nature Conservation. So the challenges, the shared challenges, the mounting challenges are there. It would be easy to despair. It would be easy to assume that the challenges are so huge that all we can do is deal with the problems of today. But we surely have to approach the challenges not with indifference, not with naive optimism, but with hope and commitment. And I want to suggest, as I come to a conclusion, three implications of that apply to all of us, whether we are Europeans at this end of the Eurasian landmass or the Chinese and others at the other end of the Eurasian landmass. We need to enlarge, firstly, our horizon of responsibility. The long term intrudes on us now. It haunts us because it will afflict our grandchildren. And so here's a thought experiment. Many people alive today in developed countries, like ours, can expect to be at the center of a chain of family relationships with people we know as individuals, extending over 7 generations, from our great-grandparents in one direction to our great-grandchildren in the other direction. And perhaps we should take that thought as a guiding principle for all of our actions in public life, in business, in family, and society. That the long term we ought responsibly to take into account is 7 generations, let's say about 150 years. How does that compare with the time frame of President Trump? But how does it compare with the time frame of China too? China is lauded often for having a long-term and strategic view of its place in the world, but its focus is strongly on 2049 at the moment, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, and whilst that's more than 1 year or 5 years, it's still 30 years only. So there's a wake-up call, I would suggest, in that for anyone, however society is organized. And the one thing we're sure of is that if we don't rise to that challenge, it is our grandchildren who will suffer, as Greta Thunberg and others regularly now remind us. It follows, secondly, that we can't avoid re-examining the whole purpose of economic development, and indeed of business, trade, and investment. With each decision we make, and I repeat that the we here is a collective we that applies as much to different levels of institutional structures of Western societies or European societies, so we do government, business, individuals, communities, but it also applies at the other end of the continent as well. With each decision we make, surely the central focus needs to be on sustainability if we're to be true to those responsibilities. And this is a direct, inescapable, and difficult challenge to anyone involved in, say, finance, the background I have, in property development, in extractive industries, in retail, shipping, transport, in fact, any area of business, as well as any of us in our capacity as consumers, and therefore all of us. And then finally, we will only do this well if we learn to listen to each other across cultures, and in particular address those questions I was raising about the different worldviews that we interact with when we engage across cultures. We cannot afford to treat the other as alien, threatening, or unreachable. If we allow ourselves to see the world of this century through Westphalian eyes, we are in the end doomed. If we treat the great questions of our time, and especially the question of how China and America will engage with each other on the world stage, as just another trap of the kind that became known in political science as a Thucydidean trap, then we're in trouble. The Thucydidean trap is a phrase coined by an American political scientist who noted that Thucydides had argued way back that when one established power is confronted by a rising power, war is inevitable. Sparta and Athens. And this scientist looked at 16 different historical occasions since then and concluded that in, I think it's 13 or 14 out of the 16 occasions, war did indeed result. And in Europe, we can think of some very obvious examples where the Thucydidean trap appears to have played out. If we assume that that's what lies in store for us, we're all in a very dangerous stasis indeed. So we need, instead, to invest educational effort as societies, but also as individuals, self-education, in understanding what forms our worldviews and how each can be enriched by the other. How many of us, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, have ever read a line of Confucius? Some hands. I wasn't going to ask for a show of hands. How many of us have heard of Zhu Xi, the most important Chinese philosopher, arguably even more than Confucius, and certainly as of greater significance in the Chinese self-understanding as Thomas Aquinas has been in a European self-understanding? I suspect very few people, just as very few Europeans will actually have read a line of Thomas Aquinas, very few Chinese have read a line of Zhu Xi, but they all know who he was. How much effort have we put in to understanding the other? And of course, I've majored on China because that's the subject of this evening, but the same set of questions could arise for the Islamic world, or for the Hindu world, or for the Japanese Buddhist world. This is both complex and fascinating, but I would argue also deeply important. And I want to end with a quotation from somebody I once had the honor of meeting, a couple of times actually, at seminars that he gave, and he once invited me to be a speaker in Tübingen. This is the great Catholic theologian, philosopher Hans Küng, who said to me, in the context actually of a seminar about the interaction of faiths and cultures around the world, he said, and every single word of this, it seems to me, is important, we must learn to judge others by their best and not just by their worst, as we would want them to judge us by our best and not just by our worst. I think every word of that's important. It seems to me as important and relevant now as when he said it to me some years ago. It applies, I would suggest, to each of us as individuals. It's our great task for the modern era. It applies to each society and the evolution of its self-understanding. And of course it applies also on the international geopolitical stage to the major powers of the 21st century as they engage with each other in an interlocked and increasingly fragile world. Without such a readiness to learn and seek the common good, the future that we bequeath to our grandchildren will surely be grim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen Greene, for this very rich and stimulating lecture, touching upon many profound and important, interesting issues like the Westphalian political order, the limits to growth and the Earth's resources, individualism and communitarianism traditions, China's re-emergence, and many others. I expect that there are many questions and reflections in the audience, so I would like to give the opportunity to anyone who would like to take the floor. Yes, there is. Yes, Jarle. If you all please introduce yourself, because I don't know the name of everyone, and wait for the microphone before you start speaking. So.
My name is Jarle Simensen, historian, university. Thank you for a great lecture. I'm a bit surprised, though, that you referred us straight back to the Westphalian order. A few things have happened in between, and the world has become more integrated in all respects. The Chinese, and not least the Russians, like to refer back to the United Nations order of 1945, which was based on, as they emphasize, national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference. And you find the most beautiful speeches given in the United Nations by Russian and Chinese representatives who praise those principles. Those principles can give room for the sort of interest game internationally that you have described. They also give room for the creation of new norms and instruments for the solution of common problems. So my question is, I noted you did not once mention the United Nations or international organizations, which is a bit strange in this country, so much dedicated to and dependent on those organizations and on internationalism. Why this neglect of internationalism in your lecture?
Thank you for the question. Part of the reason for not mentioning the United Nations explicitly was that I was told to keep my remarks to 45 minutes, but the book has got quite a lot about the international order, and in particular about the United Nations in it, because I do think the United Nations is an important feature of the modern era and a source of hope, despite its relatively underwhelming performance. I realize that I'm in Norway and this might be a sensitive and dangerous comment to make, but I'm not sure that if you were marking the United Nations overall since the war out of 10, what score you would give it. Clearly not 0, clearly not 10. Let's say, for the sake of argument, 5 or 6. Part of the task must surely be to increase the authority of genuinely recognized international structures. The United Nations and its, I don't know whether you describe them as daughter organizations like the WHO and the FAO would be others. There are, of course, problems with some other international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are not perceived by the Chinese as being fair fora for equal treatment in their respective technical areas. I spent a little bit of time in the book talking about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which I think is an interesting document. In the presence of a distinguished historian, I'm always nervous about the details because I will trip myself up, but I think 1946 or 7. 8, there you are, I knew I was going to trip myself up. And indeed, I reread the document, which is easy to do, it's not terribly long. And I was struck, on the one hand, by how imaginative and far-sighted it is in some ways. I mean, talking about paid holidays and guaranteed education, at least at elementary level, and various other things that look surprisingly advanced for the time when it was produced. But I was also struck by the absence of almost any reference to the value of culture and of cultural awareness. There are, I think, certainly one and maybe two passing references to it. And I can't help, firstly, and secondly, the absence of almost any reference to responsibilities to balance the rights. And I would suspect that if we collectively, as the community of nations, tried to do it again, we would come up with a rather different document. And of course, thirdly, there is no reference at all to planetary responsibilities in it. What do I conclude from all that? The United Nations is important. We would not improve human welfare by dismantling the United Nations. But I don't think we should be naive about the degree of influence it has. You refer to the Chinese and the Russians making elegant speeches. Of course, it suited them to emphasize those principles that you describe, which are in fact Westphalian principles, I think I would argue. And it's not clear how far a China or an India is prepared to genuflect to the collective will of the United Nations as it is currently expressed. So, to cut the long story short, I do think the United Nations, of course, is an important feature of the world scene and a significant step forward by reference to human history. But I think we shouldn't conclude from that that the world is ready to organize itself on something other than basically Westphalian principles and a balance of power for the foreseeable future.
Yes, thank you. There's still a possibility to, yes, please.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. My name is Arne Cornelius, and I manage NRSCI, which is a geopolitical advisory firm. Over the last decade, I've traveled extensively on expeditions by overland, by train, bus, and cars across Africa, Asia, the Middle East. On all my travels, I've seen a lot of Chinese business people, Chinese merchants, Chinese workers, across Africa. I've been to 40 countries in Africa, or 42. And I traveled on the last expedition from Shanghai to Istanbul on the ground. Met a lot of Chinese. But the absence of Americans on the ground across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, except for the American military, American embassies, and the American private equity advisors you'll meet in the capitals, is staggering. So my point is, in the end, and there was something you didn't touch on, that is that the United States lack the two things that is really propelling Chinese growth internationally. And that is the Chinese industrial capacity of turnkey solutions and the Chinese public-private financial partnerships. The United States hasn't grasped this and they haven't developed this. So my question is, when we at some point reach a geopolitical inflection point where China passes the United States, and when China surpasses the United States' power and position globally, which external factors do you think will influence whether we then come into a Thucydides trap and actually come into a conflict scenario, or actually we will have somehow peaceful coexistence? Which external factors will be most influential, and which scenario do you think is most likely? Thank you.
Where to begin? I don't myself think that, I think it's easy to be too bearish about America. I think America, you're right about turnkey projects and the ability of Americans to match that extraordinary Chinese presence, which is sort of there wherever you go. I was in, as an anecdote, as an aside, I was in Greenland earlier this year, sorry, last year, on a sort of I'd describe it as an educational tourist visit organized by a thing called the European Climate Foundation. And I learned a number of things there. And we were there 1 week after Trump had tried to buy Greenland, or made his offer to buy Greenland, which was crass and slightly bizarre, but not irrational, when you think that Greenland has a third of the world's deposits of rare earths. China has got a lot of the rest of them. So you could see where the interest came from. But the third most numerous visitors to Greenland, after the Danes obviously, and then Americans, are indeed the Chinese. And we've just come back from Ecuador, where the number of Chinese visitors is growing very fast. In other words, this underscores your point that sort of wherever you go now, you find more and more Chinese visitors. By the way, in the Paris metro, on the Central Line, those of you familiar with it, ligne numéro 1, you will, there's a voiceover at every station telling you to make sure you take your bags and have a nice day in several different languages. French first, of course, English second, German third, I think it is, and Chinese fourth. So this is a pervasive phenomenon. Does that mean, though, that China is about to overtake America geopolitically? I don't think so. It's easy to be seduced by simple numbers. So the Chinese military is the largest in the world. That does not make the Chinese army the most sophisticated in the world. The Chinese have more ships than the US does. That certainly does not make the Chinese Navy equal to the American Navy. But there is no doubt that they will gain in weight, and they have a strong sense of their of the appropriateness of their taking a position on the world stage. And why wouldn't they? You know, the British thought it was perfectly natural 100 years ago. The Americans think it's perfectly natural now. Why wouldn't a large, powerful, sophisticated economy with a strong sense of its own and pride in its own culture and history want its position in the sun on the world stage? What do I conclude from that? I conclude, I think, what I've said. I think the important thing is to engage and not treat the overall task as being one of containment and distancing. And to that extent, I think both Europe and Japan actually are being put in a dilemma that they've never previously had to face. We've never previously, and this is we collectively, the Europeans and also the Japanese, have never had to make a choice between a strong relationship with China and a strong relationship with America. And you are hearing noises out of the American administration which essentially are pressing for us to make a choice. I personally think that would be unwise. It would be unwise to get off on the side of the fence that the Americans want us to get off on. I think that engagement is right. Obviously not naive engagement, but nevertheless engagement is right, and a sense that the appropriate approach to China is containment and that it's a strategic threat is, in my view, misconceived.
Yes, again, the floor is open. So, yes, please.
I'm Andrew Whitelaw. My background is I'm a professor of medicine both here in Oslo and in Bristol in UK. Wonderful lecture. You mentioned the contrast between individualism and conformity. US being a very good example of an individualistic society, and perhaps China much more conformist. And I just wonder whether you think over the next decades the people in China will become more individualistic, and perhaps as a result of that will question how the country is run, and there will be more diversity politically.
Thank you. I don't think I did use the word conformity, and indeed I would, I think, a bit resile from using the word conformity. I think anybody, I mean, I know China a bit. I know there are some people here who know China much better than I do, but I think they would agree with me in saying that there's an enormous vivacious individual life in China, and it's not a highly conformist society.
I meant politically.
Well, except when it's made to be, and there have been periods in history when it's been made to be conformist. I don't think that's its natural self. And indeed, the Confucian ethos, which I did refer to, doesn't, I mean, the trouble is single words mislead if we're not careful. There is a sense, a clear sense in the Confucian ethos of the individual's place in the order of things, of a set of familial responsibilities, of a set of social responsibilities, and indeed in the medieval Confucian synthesis, a cosmic sense of where the individual fits. Nevertheless, I think it would be wrong to see China as a society where the individual has been kind of essentially eviscerated of any individuality. I don't think that's true. And when you read Chinese literature, and I quote a little, one of the things I enjoyed most about writing my book, by the way, was exploring literature from the different cultures. And I quote Japanese, Chinese, Indian, Islamic, as well as European literature. And you find a wonderful, vivacious individuality coming through from both recent and from older texts. Sadly, I have to read them in English. I can't read them in Chinese, I wish. So I wouldn't want to see it as a simple comparison between the individual and the conformist. I think it's more complex than that. But I do think there is a difference between the center of gravity of American self-understanding, and I do underscore, I think it's an American thing more than it's a European thing, of that individualism, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you know, the Lockean principle, the government should do as little as possible and leave you to get on with your life. And on the other hand, a Confucian view of the world, which does have a view of where people should have a view of the individual's place in the order of things. I think we would all be enriched if we each understood more about the other.
Yes, now, suddenly. Kristin Novitsmark, and then I have Aud Tønnesen.
Thank you. My name is Kristin Novitsland, and knowing very little about China, I think this was a very educational lecture, but I would just like to ask a question out of pure ignorance, I have to say, but you tend to emphasize very greatly Confucianism. That has been so fundamentally formative to Chinese mentality and culture. But what about then the Cultural Revolution and the very serious attempts to erase it? And hasn't that also left very significant marks on what we today, how we today find or experience Chinese culture?
Yeah, I think well, two things. First of all, any discussion of a rich, complex culture like that of China is bound to simplify to some extent. And indeed, just by majoring on Confucianism, as I have done, I overlook or don't mention the contributions of both Taoism and Buddhism, which are also important in the Chinese self-understanding. And indeed, the Confucianism which emerged in the Middle Ages, and I referred to the particular individual who was the great Thomas Aquinas of China, if you will, was certainly borrowing from Taoism as well, and indeed, though he wouldn't acknowledge it, borrowing from Buddhism. So that's one thing. So the Confucianism itself is a complex phenomenon where what I'm seeking to do is to pull out some essential characteristics, if you will, without trying to pretend that I've fully described it. But secondly, the Cultural Revolution, you're absolutely right. There was an explicit attempt to erase Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism and Christianity as well, and it didn't succeed. And I think that's a particularly interesting result. And if you go to China now, not only do you hear in the rhetoric of the government reference to approaches to life which can only reasonably be described as Confucian, but also you will see temples, Confucian shrines, Taoist temples, Buddhist temples, Christian churches, etc., all clearly functioning in a rather visible and prominent way in the big cities. So I regard the Cultural Revolution as not certainly not something that didn't leave its impact. You know, it had a terrible impact. And we're still sufficiently near to it that when you talk to individuals of anybody above the age of 50, at least, they have a very clear memory of it. And it's painful for many millions of people. There was also immense destruction, as we know, of cultural artifacts from the great Chinese traditions. And we might say a quiet prayer of gratitude that so much ended up in Taipei in 1949, because if it hadn't, it might have been destroyed. Another way of putting the question that you've asked is, what is the legacy now? To what extent is the Chinese government or the Chinese party, Communist Party, really communist? Is another way of putting the question. And I think it's, if you mean by communist somebody who really abides by either a Marxist in its original sense or Leninist view of the way you should run societies, I think you'd find very few genuine communists in the whole of China. It is an authoritarian party. It is not it does not believe in elective democracy, except within the party itself. It does not believe in elective democracy. It believes in a mixed economy, so the private sector is vibrant, but the state sector is also quite prominent. So it's, I don't know, it's still the Communist Party of China. In some senses, it's a motherland party rather than a communist party, or as much a motherland party as it is a communist party. And certainly if there's any meaning in the term communist or Marxist, you'd have to stretch that so far to find it applicable to any major initiatives of the Chinese government today.
Aud Tønnesen.
Thank you so much. I really also don't know very much about the Chinese history, but I was thinking about Hong Kong in this pattern that you could say you have described between a Western American worldview and self-understanding, very individual, and the Chinese Confucian-inspired or marked by Confucius thinking. We have been following for a long time now the protests in Hong Kong, and we see how they organize through social media and the attention they get, and the protests are addressed against, of course, politics, legal regulations, and also mainland China. And I was thinking, can Hong Kong be somehow described, because the European and of course the British impact on Hong Kong has been very strong. Are these protests some kind of a result of a hybrid identity where these two identities clashes or don't find their space? I was just wondering.
How to answer that? I lived in Hong Kong for 11 years. In the 80s and early 90s, and I have been to Hong Kong at least once a year ever since. So it's a city that feels like part of my home. You're right, it's a sort of hybrid identity, Hong Kong. It's a historical accident. It was taken by the British at a moment of Chinese weakness that was deeply humiliating for China. The British would have, I suspect, abandoned it long before, had it not been for what happened in 1949. I suspect. After all, Britain had given up any other significant colonies it got. Why did it hang on to Hong Kong? Not because it felt it especially wanted to, I suspect. And the result has been this extraordinarily vibrant city that nobody ever planned, and which has got a sort of an identity of its own, which isn't, it's markedly different in outlook from much of mainland China, bit more similar to Taipei, but not exactly, but not entirely just a kind of Western implant either. It's become sui generis, to use the Latin phrase, and it's going through some difficult times at the moment, and I wouldn't care to sit here and issue a forecast as to how this will play out. It's a complicated story where the original trigger for the demonstrations was something initiated by the Hong Kong government, not by the Beijing government, and where I think the kindest friends of the Hong Kong government would say there were a series of missteps, and it's foliated into something more complex, where there are a number of domestic socio-economic issues in Hong Kong itself, which people ask to be addressed, and where there's a nervousness, particularly on the part of the young, as to what happens when the current basic law runs out in 2049. Sorry, 2047. When people who are now in their 20s will be in their 50s, will it be simply another Chinese mainland city at that point, or will it continue to have some kind of special status, is a question beginning to raise itself in the minds, particularly of young people.
Yes, now I have several. First is Nils Christian Stenseth.
Thank you very much for a very, very nice and enlightening talk. China has tremendous ambition internationally. You mentioned the one road, one belt. That is one of them. And they are really pushing that forward a lot. The Chinese Academy of Science, they are having very clear plans of having hubs around in the various parts of the world. They don't have one in Europe, and they are very concerned about that. They want to have a hub to operate from in international collaboration. I've been to been listening to many talks in US, where there's a majority of US citizens, scientists, and the impression you get from the speaker, high ranking, are that we are the best. We are the best. The rest of the world should learn from us. In China, that's not the case. I recently have listened to partly the Minister of Science and the Prime Minister, and both of them said that we have very high ambition internationally, but we aren't the best. We are not the best, but we will become better. They repeated that again and again. My question to you, is that a strategy? Make people work harder? Or is it simply the fact? I think it is the fact, actually. Your comment on this.
Well, I suspect that there are some areas of technical excellence where they are now plausibly the best. They're certainly ambitious. Why shouldn't they be ambitious? And I think it's dangerous if the American scientific fraternity is happily asserting that it's the best. This might just be the pride that comes before a fall if they're not careful. I mean, I would suggest that a better approach is that of the Chinese, which is to have some ambition, but to recognize that you've got plenty to learn and therefore reasons to engage. The scientific research is not an area that I'm closely familiar with, as you will be aware from our conversation just before we came in. But it's interesting that there's no hub in Europe. I find that, I don't know whether that's a comment on what the Chinese think about the Europeans or whether they just haven't got around to it yet. That would be interesting to explore. It parallels the development of their cultural outreach. So the Confucius Institutes are now spread in hundreds around the world. And that's an initiative that I think is only about 20 years old, maybe 30. And they are now as pervasive as Goethe institutes and British councils and Institut Français, etc. And that tells you that they've got they're every bit as determined as the rest of us are to make sure that our cultural presence and our cultural brand, if I can use such a crass word, is understood by the rest of the world. So they've certainly got ambition.
Yes, now the gentleman beside Jarle Simonsen there. Yeah.
So, thank you. Marius Timanjolan from the Faculty of Theology, University of Oslo. I have a question concerning your last quote, beautiful quote from Hans Küng, the theologian, where you emphasize the values and what you can learn from each other. I want to ask the role of religion today in China, which I guess is rather ambiguous in many respects. It has been opened up. I've heard of tendencies of strong repression. Is it seen as a threat or as an opportunity, for instance, politically and spiritually in China today? How do you see it?
Thank you. Religion's quite a complex phenomenon, of course, and I alluded earlier to the strands of Confucian, Buddhist, Taoist, and one might add kind of local folk religious practices. We in Europe, in the West, perhaps inevitably think about the position of the Christian church in China, but of course, as far as the Chinese are concerned, that's just one of the various manifestations of religious life in China. I do remember meeting a few years ago, well, this would be about 3-4 years ago, the then State Administration for Religious Affairs, and we had a very good conversation with the head of that, from which it became clear that they valued the Christian presence in China, let me say the mainstream Christian presence in China, by which they didn't only mean the formally registered churches necessarily, and what they valued them for was the way in which they promote social cohesion, provide education, provide literacy in rural areas, and things like that. So they saw the social value of religious activities, even though they're ideologically, as party members will have not recognized the substance of the religious claim at all. For them, numerically, by far the largest presence of over religious life is Buddhist. People always debate the numbers, and I suspect nobody really knows, but the Buddhist presence is probably at least 5 times the size of a Christian presence, and maybe more than that. And the one that they're most worried about, for reasons that we will all recognize, is, of course, Islam. So there's no simple answer to the question, but broadly, where they see religious activity as not directly challenging the legitimacy of the state and the party, and see it as performing useful social functions, frankly in a rather Confucian manner, then they are at least tolerant. It comes and goes, and it varies in different parts of the country. I think it would be important to add.
Nils Roll Hansen.
Yeah, my name is Nils Roll Hansen, and I'm a historian and philosopher of science, special interest in biology and environmental science. And I have to say, I'm a little puzzled at the way you polarize the world between China and the United States. You take United States as sort of the essence of the European civilization. You didn't do that, maybe, but it sounded almost like that. And it seems that this is emphasizing too much economics and technology and the military powers. And I think that it might be more interesting if you focused a little more on Europe, which has had a sort of intermediary position between China and the kind of culture which America represents at the moment. And I mean, Europe, you have to remember that Russia is also a European culture. Very much, I think. After all, Marxism is sort of part of the essence of European culture. So, I mean, if you focus more on Europe, what would you then say about future developments? Isn't there something to be sort of learned from the role of Europe, despite its economic and military not so powerful presence at the moment.
Well, thank you. First of all, I would protest that I don't think America and Europe are the same. They overlap, and there are certain, clearly, values, attitudes that they share in common, but they are not identical. The country in Europe which is most likely to fall into the trap of thinking they are identical is Britain. Britain is seduced by the fact that we all speak the same language, sort of, and we overlook the deep, in my view, deep differences in the center of gravity of American attitudes, opinions, instincts compared with Europeans. By the same token, think the British have got more in common with the rest of Europe than some Britons like to admit. And therefore, I think there is a cohesive, it is meaningful to talk about the European presence on the world stage and to ask what it is that Europe stands for in a 20th century, which is, however, going to be dominated by the US and by China primarily. That poses a challenge for Europe, and had I got another 45 minutes or the next lecture, I would love to explore the implications for Europe, because I think they are both important and troubling. I say important because I think Europe has got an enormous amount to offer to the world of cultural interaction that I've been talking about. I think we Europeans have something that we stand for and ought to be able to articulate with self-confidence or confidence on the world stage, and we don't do it enough. But I'm troubled because of the inward-looking tendency of so much European debate about the challenges that Europe faces. And its inability to look out and see the wider world so often and have a view of what it has to offer, which is a rich, enormously exciting and indeed important learning through its history of ups and downs about what makes for a good life, what makes for the common good. But I think there's a whole other discussion to be had about that. And just to add to the complexity of all this, I've inevitably not talked about either Islam in any great extent or the Indians to any great extent, and both of them have a rich heritage of cultural understanding which it would be good to explore and find the commonalities and the mutual learnings and enrichment. I did mention Zhu Xi, the great synthesizer in Chinese philosophy, and dared to suggest that he's the parallel to Aquinas. I might also have mentioned Avicenna in an Islamic context, or Nagarjuna in the Indian one. You can find human searches for the good in all of these cultures. That's what makes the engagement so enriching and exciting, and that's what makes a sense that the right thing to do is strategically contain and hold back so depressing as well as dangerous.
There's a gentleman in the back there.
Hi, my name is Jonas Tobiasen. I currently study at Tsinghua in Beijing. I'm on holiday here, and I've worked at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace before, and I've listened to lectures by Graham Allison and so on. This is maybe a weird question, but if you were in Carrie Lam's position, what would you do differently? Yeah.
I'm glad I'm not in her position. It's very easy for me to sit behind this desk in a comfortable room and lecture the Hong Kong government on how to handle what I think has become a difficult situation. I think it would be good, I think they do, it would be good to recognize that there are quite a lot of genuine domestic issues to be addressed in Hong Kong. I mean, the most obvious one, it's now widely talked about, is housing. Hong Kong has become a very crowded place. When we lived there were 5 million people. There are now well over 7 million, and the numbers continue to grow. The housing stock is not big enough. There are too many people, particularly young people, living with parents in what are already very small apartments. and it's a very dense environment. There are some things you can do about that. There are some measures to, indeed, some quite potentially kind of proactive, strong measures that could be taken to address some of that. So the general point, without going into too much detail of the specifics of Hong Kong, is that I think there are some genuine domestic concerns that could be addressed in a way which would actually go down well with a lot of people. So but it's quite complex.
Yes, I think we should start thinking about wrapping up now, but so we still have time for some questions. And Dagfinn Føllesdal.
Yeah, I'm Dagfinn Føllesdal. I'm also from philosophy. And when I'm thinking about the future of the development in China, I think that what you said about Confucianism will be quite important, because I think there are lots of very, very good elements in Confucianism that are really deeply rooted in the majority of the Chinese population, although they haven't studied Confucius as a philosopher. But the attitudes are important. And what I've been spending several longer periods in China. My wife and I spent a semester in Shanghai, and also been teaching for a semester in Hong Kong and also in Beijing. And I think that what I noticed is that these very good tendencies that you find in the population, at least a part of it that I've been in contact with, are sometimes opposed to the views of the government. And many people now, I was in Beijing twice last year, many people expressed their distaste for the present leader of China because he had extended his period in illegal ways. But they were careful not to utter this publicly. So the danger of saying something critical publicly is one of the big problems in China. In Shanghai, there was a conference, and I wanted to talk about roles and the theory of justice. And they wanted to talk to me beforehand, before I touched some of the sensitive fields, because they were worried what could happen if I touched on some fields that would be against the political views. Yeah. And now we think that Hong Kong might be a very good place, but I spent a semester in Hong Kong, and I was very worried about the philosophy students I had there. I think about 90% of them showed an interest in philosophy, but they were really all majoring in business. So I think that Hong Kong has a kind of attitude which is not really, fortunately, typical of China as a whole.
Yeah. I agree with much of that. Can I make such two? I mean, you didn't pose a question so much as an observation. Just a couple of thoughts that stimulates, but they're not a kind of direct riposte or anything. First is that I think that Europeans who don't know China well, and clearly there are a number of people in this room who do know China well, underestimate the extent of the, at street level, of the patriotism in China, of the pride in what has been achieved for all of the things that have gone wrong. That there's an almost tangible sense that the country has overcome what they see, with some reason, as 150 years of international humiliation, and have China has, Mao said it in 1949 on the steps of the Forbidden City. The people of China have stood up, and in a sense that phrase still resonates today. And I could cite various anecdotes of where this has come up in conversation. And I think that's always worth keeping at the back of our minds whenever we're thinking about current attitudes within China about the way things are and the way and the direction of some aspects of state interaction with the individual. That we should never forget that there's an enormous wealth of patriotism and sense of accomplishment which the government draws on. If, to put it in a historic Chinese phraseology, the Communist Party has very definitely got the mandate of heaven. And there's no sign, at least for the foreseeable future, of their losing that. Now, the mandate of heaven is a two-edged thought, as Chinese history repeatedly tells you. But as of now, I think it's worth recognizing that I believe that that's the case, and I think it's worth recognizing it. A subsidiary point to that is that one thing the government has done in recent years, which is widely popular in China, is to clean up the corruption. I guess many individual Chinese would say, and it's not complete yet, and there's always, you're never perfect, and blah, blah, blah. But there's a very widespread recognition, and it's deeply popular, that corruption has been tackled proactively and aggressively. And again, I make that as an observation as part of the understanding of where people may be coming from in the China of today.
We'll have one last comment, and then we will wrap up this interesting session. Yes, the gentleman there in the...
Thank you. My name is Magnus Leon. I'm an economist, but looking around in this room, I will be very careful to call myself an academic. I spent the spring of last year in Russia, and talking to a lot of young people there, I sensed that many were very concerned about the introduction of a new internet law, sovereign internet in Russia, somewhat similar to the internet firewall in China. And I find it very interesting that amidst this internationalization that was mentioned earlier, and the globalization that China is very much a part of, and the global expansion that, in terms of business, politics, and diplomacy, that China is currently in the midst of, that social control, especially on the internet, is largely enforced, and in an even greater sense now than in years prior, and probably this is a development that will continue. And this, especially with this social point system that is taken right out of literally a Black Mirror episode, for those who have seen that. And I just wondered what is, if you can, how to say, in Norwegian we would say, take the temperature of the Chinese. How do people feel about this? And you mentioned many times this sense of collectivism, if not conformism. So I'm very curious what your answer and your comments to this somewhat concern of mine. Yeah.
Well, I think you're right to be concerned about Russia too. I think it's hard to answer the question in anything other than a headline way, though. When you go to China, you are struck by the way in which, well, one or two other speakers have referred to it. People can sometimes be guarded in what they're ready to say. But you're also struck by the vibrancy of ordinary street-level city life. This does not feel like a society which is cowed. I mentioned a little while back that we were in Qingdao recently. I remember going into a brand new shopping mall, and there are thousands of people, ordinary families, going around their normal, as it happens, Sunday morning business of shopping and finding a restaurant where they can have a cup of coffee or have some dim sum and chatting, and there's no sign that this is I mean, I have never been to Pyongyang, and I can't imagine what that's like. This isn't like that at all. This is a vibrant, modernizing, and quite self-confident society in so many ways. So they've got plenty of challenges ahead. Sometimes I think Western commentators on China assume that the leadership is sitting there in Beijing, smiling and waiting to take the world over. The reality, of course, is quite different from that. The leadership in Beijing worries about all sorts of challenges, large, small, near, far. I mean, what are they worried about at the moment, of course? I mean, can you imagine having to take the decision to isolate and close down a city of 11 million people because of an unknown virus? Yeah, I've been to Wuhan, and dare say some others here have been to Wuhan. This is a vibrant, exciting, lively, it's not attractive, it's not a physically attractive city, but it's attractive because all human life is there, and they've had to close it down. I mean, you know, what are they worried about at the moment? Not taking the world over, not worrying about how to toughen up the internet firewalls, I suspect, but just dealing with this problem. And I say that really just to underscore the sheer complexity of governing a huge and fast-changing society, which is interacting with the rest of the world because why wouldn't it? You know, we expect the Americans to interact with the rest of the world. We expect Europeans. Europeans have interacted down history. Why wouldn't China? I think it would be wrong to treat this as a sort of repressive, mind-controlling system which has depressed people into a sort of cowed obeisance. It's just not like that when you go there. And so life's complicated.
Well, that's a good note to end on. And once again, thank you very much, Stephen Greene, for this wonderfully inspiring lecture and conversation, which by no means exhausts the subject. But for those who are interested in learning more, there is the possibility, of course, having the book signed and to buy it. So I would like to thank you and thank the audience for the participation. Thank you all.